He went undercover to see how his employees really worked. But when he heard what the manager was saying behind his back, everything changed. Jonathan Blake, CEO of Blake's department stores, adjusted his name tag. Today, he wasn't a billionaire. He was just John, the new trainee. For weeks he had received complaints about low morale, rude management, and unfair treatment in some of his stores. So, instead of relying on reports, he decided to see the truth for himself. Dressed in a simple uniform and worn-out sneakers, he walked into one of his busiest locations, blending in with the other employees. At first, everything seemed normal. Customers shopped, employees worked, and the store manager, Rick Dawson, stood behind the counter, watching everything like a hawk. But then, Jonathan heard something that made him stop cold. Rick was laughing loudly, whispering to another employee. "You see that guy? The new trainee? What a joke! If only he knew this store is a sinking ship. The higher-ups don't care about us, so why should I?" The other employee chuckled nervously. "What if corporate finds out?" Rick rolled his eyes. "Please, corporate never steps foot in here. As long as sales don't drop, they don't care what I do." Jonathan's jaw clenched. So this was how his managers spoke about the company? About him? He took a deep breath. He could have revealed his identity right then and there. But instead, he decided to teach Rick a lesson he'd never forget. And by the next morning, the entire store would be in shock. The trap is set. Jonathan spent the rest of the shift watching, listening, and taking mental notes, and the more he saw, the angrier he became. Rick barely did any work. He barked orders at employees but spent most of his time on his phone. He treated customers terribly. When an elderly woman asked for help, he sighed loudly and muttered, "Not my problem." He created a toxic workplace. Employees looked defeated, exhausted, and afraid to speak up. And worst of all, no one dared to challenge him, because they believed no one from corporate cared. They were wrong. At the end of the night, as Jonathan clocked out, he turned to Rick. "Thanks for the training. I'll see you tomorrow?" Rick snorted. "Yeah, sure. But let's be real. You'll probably quit soon like the rest of them." Jonathan forced a smile. "We'll see." As he walked out, he pulled out his phone and made one call to his executive team. "Clear your schedules. We have a meeting first thing in the morning, and cancel Rick Dawson's access to the system. He won't need it anymore." Tomorrow, everything was about to change. The big reveal. The next morning, Rick Dawson strutted into the store like he owned the place. Employees moved quickly to avoid him, heads down, afraid of being singled out. But just as Rick reached his office, he froze. Because standing there, dressed in a tailored suit, no longer in disguise, was Jonathan Blake, the CEO. Rick's face turned pale. Mr. Blake, what are you doing here?" Jonathan folded his arms. "I work here, remember? You trained me yesterday." A horrified silence fell over the store as employees stopped what they were doing, watching the scene unfold. Rick stammered. "Sir, I had no idea." Jonathan held up a hand. "Save it. I heard everything. The way you talked about this company, the way you treat employees, the way you ignore customers." Rick swallowed hard. "Sir, I was just joking." Jonathan's voice was calm but firm. "So you were joking when you said this store was a sinking ship? That corporate doesn't care? That customers aren't your problem?" Rick's silence said it all. Jonathan turned to the employees, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Listen up. This company was built on respect, integrity, and customer service. If any manager thinks they can run their store like a dictatorship, think again." He locked eyes with Rick. "You're fired. Effective immediately." Gasps rippled through the store. Rick's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "Sir, please." Jonathan shook his head. "No second chances. Pack your things and leave." Rick stormed out, humiliated, as employees exchanged shocked but relieved looks. Then Jonathan turned back to them. "Now, let's talk about how we fix this store, together." For the first time in years, the employees felt heard. And as Jonathan rolled up his sleeves, ready to work beside them, they realized something. Corporate did care, and everything was about to change for the better. A new beginning. With Rick Dawson gone, the entire store felt different. For the first time in years, employees weren't walking on eggshells. They weren't afraid of speaking up, and it all started with one meeting. Jonathan gathered every employee in the break room, standing in front of them, not as a CEO, but as a leader who finally saw the truth. "I owe all of you an apology," he began. "You've been working under terrible leadership, and for too long, no one stepped in to fix it. That changes today." A murmur spread through the room. Employees exchanged hesitant glances. One of them, Samantha, a cashier who had been with the store for 5 years, spoke up. "Do you really mean that? Or is this just a PR stunt?" Jonathan smiled. "You tell me." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a stack of papers. Company policy changes, wage adjustments, and new leadership training programs. Salaries were increasing. No more barely scraping by. New management was being hired, from within. Employees who had worked hard for years were finally getting promoted. Workplace culture was being rebuilt. Respect and appreciation were no longer optional. They were mandatory. Gasps filled the room. Another employee, Mark, who had been ignored by Rick for months, whispered, This is real?" Jonathan nodded. "This is real, and I need your help to make it work." For the first time, the employees felt like they mattered. Jonathan spent the entire week working beside them, helping customers, stocking shelves, learning their names and stories. And as he did, something incredible happened. Customers started noticing. Word spread that Blake's department store wasn't just another corporate chain. It was a company that actually cared about its workers. And within months, sales skyrocketed. Employee morale was at an all-time high, and that once struggling store, it became one of the most successful locations in the entire company, all because one CEO finally listened. And as Jonathan watched his employees thrive under new leadership, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about fixing one store. It was about setting a new standard for every store in the country. Because when you take care of your employees, they take care of everything else. 1 year later, the changes Jonathan made didn't just transform one store, they sparked a movement. Across the country, every Blake's department store location adopted the new policies: higher wages, better working conditions, employee promotions from within, leadership training to ensure no more Rick Dawsons ever ran a store again. And the result? Record-breaking success. Sales skyrocketed. Customer satisfaction was at an all-time high. And for the first time, employees felt valued. A historic announcement. Jonathan stood on a massive stage at the company's annual conference, looking out at thousands of store employees, managers, and executives. Behind him, a giant screen displayed the company's new slogan, "People first, always." Taking a deep breath, he began, "A year ago, I walked into one of my own stores, Undercover. What I saw changed me. Employees overworked and underpaid, managers who didn't care, a toxic culture that I had ignored for too long." He paused, scanning the crowd. "But today, we're not that company anymore." Applause erupted through the arena. Jonathan smiled. "We proved that when you take care of your people take care of everything else. And because of all of you, Blake's department stores just had the most successful year in company history." The cheers grew louder. Then, Jonathan turned toward the front row, where Samantha and Mark, 2 employees from that very first store, sat. "And now it's time for the next step." The screen behind him changed. $100 million employee profit-sharing initiative. Gasps filled the room. Jonathan's voice was steady. "From now on, every single employee, no matter what position, Will, a life-changing moment. The room fell completely silent. Thousands of employees held their breath, eyes wide as they stared at the screen. Jonathan continued, his voice strong. From now on, every single employee, no matter what position, will share in the company's success. When we grow, you grow. Gasps rippled through the crowd. This wasn't just another corporate announcement. This was history. Samantha, the cashier who had once doubted if corporate even cared, covered her mouth, tears forming in her eyes. Mark, who had been overlooked for years, shook his head in disbelief. Then, applause erupted. Not polite claps, thunderous, emotional applause. People stood, cheering, hugging, crying. For the first time, they weren't just employees. They were part of something bigger. Jonathan smiled, stepping back, letting them soak it all in. This wasn't just about profits, it was about people. And as he looked out at the thousands of employees whose lives were about to change, he knew one thing for certain. The company he had once built was finally the company it was always meant to be. Because when you put people first, success always follows. And this was just the beginning.